If you've watched as many movies as I have, it's likely that you have a playlist somewhere with your personal favorite bits of musical score from your favorite movies. I certainly do. It has over 200 tracks and is about 14 and a half hours long. I've got some of the classics that you'd expect from some movies that you'd probably also expect. This particular track is one of my most played, and when I was putting the playlist together, it was the fourth song that I selected. The melody is just so calming and beautiful, yet there's something haunting about it. It's mournful, and I experience several different emotions over its 5-minute duration. It's one of the most beautiful pieces of music I've ever heard composed for a movie, and that movie is the 1995 family comedy film, Casper. Yeah, the one with the friendly ghost. When discussing a specific film on my channel, I often make a point to talk about as many elements of it as possible. Film is a collaborative process, one that takes several talented people coming together to create one work that, if things go well, has the potential to be remembered for generations. In the case of Casper, there were several notable talents involved in the production. ILM was still breaking new ground in the world of computer-generated imagery, and the special effects of Casper were hailed as revolutionary for their time. Honestly, because they're so cartoony and stylized, the ghosts themselves still hold up pretty well today. I also really appreciate how far the actors went to match the campy tone of the film, specifically Eric Idle and Kathy Moriarty as the villains. I have a bit of a soft spot for this movie since I grew up watching it, but it's far from perfect, and as I've gotten older, I've found no desire to return to it nearly as much as I did when I was a kid. What fascinates me most about Casper is how my biggest issues with the film's story are what gives me my absolute favorite thing about it. You see, the attempted emotional focus of the film is where the fun parts of it really start to drag. Ultimately, this is a movie about ghosts, so discussions of death are going to happen, and the screenplay has a very strange way of dealing with it. In a lot of scenes, death is portrayed as a punchline. The ghosts themselves don't have any real memory of their lives, so they all act like goofballs who have forgotten everything about who they are, unless of course they're the main villain who remembers exactly who she is because the plot calls for it. I actually don't have too many major problems with the logic of this world, more so with how it tries to have some emotional scenes. They just don't work for me. I'm confused by how this film wants me to feel. Sometimes it wants me to laugh about death, and other times it wants me to cry. Casper is not a film that can make me cry, but it actually gets pretty close. That is because of James Horner. The winner of 2 Academy Awards, the late James Horner is celebrated for his collaborations with James Cameron on Titanic and Avatar. With Aliens, An American Tail, The Wrath of Khan, Apollo 13, and my personal favorite, The Mask of Zorro under his belt, Horner's contribution to Casper is relatively overlooked nowadays. While I'm sure many, including myself, see Casper as an inoffensive, adequate family film, at the very least, I believe Horner saw the potential in the film's themes surrounding death and loss, and composed Casper's Lullaby with an understanding of just how impactful those themes are. As much as I don't care for the emotional elements of the story, if Casper's Lullaby is what I get for enduring those elements, I'll take it. It's just such a gorgeously haunting melody. The soft choir backing up the elegant strings, and of course that absolutely brilliant piano piece. James Horner took what could have been an entirely forgettable emotional climax and made it into something greater, something that is memorable. So memorable that when putting together my playlist, it was among the first tracks that I had to include. It's fair to say that I've listened to Casper's Lullaby more times than I've watched the movie that it's from, and it was upon listening to it again that I got to thinking about the topic for this video. I'm going to provide some examples of musical scores that I consider to be better than their movies. Despite my nostalgic feelings for some of the movies that I'm going to be talking about, I choose to listen to their scores rather than rewatch them again. To be clear, I don't consider the films that I'm going to be mentioning here as entirely bad. Actually, the point of this video is to remind everyone to look at the elements of movies that they may not entirely enjoy with the hope of finding something that they do. Similarly to Casper, I also have a soft spot for the 1996 film Dragonheart. I'd even go as far to say that I f***ing loved this movie as a kid. Of course, that love comes from years and years spent watching it as a kid, and because it has a talking dragon in it. I like talking dragons. They make me smile. Of course, as is the theme of this video, Dragonheart is far from a masterpiece. It also deals with a very inconsistent tone, but has the inverse problem of Casper. That movie began as a silly comedy that tried to get serious by the end. Dragonheart starts out very serious, its plot focusing on a young prince who is mortally wounded and receives a piece of a dragon's heart to survive. Years later, the prince has grown up to be an evil king, and the knight that once served him blames the dragon for his tyranny, claiming that its heart corrupted the boy. The knight, whose name is Bowen by the way, spends years as a dragon slayer, and engages in a battle with a dragon named Draco, who reveals to Bowen that he is the last dragon alive. The two form an unlikely partnership, wherein Draco pretends to be slain by Bowen so that Bowen can keep earning a living, and Draco can in turn keep on living. The friendship that forms between Bowen and Draco was something that I always really liked as a kid, and I still think that it's pretty sweet. But some of the slapstick humor and jokes really clash with the way the film begins. This is a gritty, serious start to a story that suddenly becomes a slapstick farce for a while before deciding to get serious again toward the final act. I feel like there's a much better story in here than what we got, but I do genuinely enjoy it for what it is. Draco is just great. Sean Connery makes this character so endearing and gives him a very charming, regal presence. Obviously, the CG is pretty dated, but I don't mind it too much when it's just the two characters talking to one another. I also have a real issue with Dennis Quaid's performance in this. I'm not really sure what he's trying to do here. It's like he started experimenting with some kind of accent, but didn't go all the way with it, and he flip-flops between this really growly voice and his normal voice way too much. The villain is also pretty bland, the only interesting thing about him being the realization that he was always evil, with the dragon's heart having nothing to do with it. But I feel that this realization would have been much more powerful if we didn't have the scene right at the beginning with him literally fighting with his dying dad over his crown. I don't know, I just feel like that could have been handled in a much more subtle way. With all that said though, the ending of this movie used to absolutely destroy me as a kid, and it still manages to get me as an adult. If it wasn't pretty clear already, Draco is the dragon whose heart now resides in the villain, and this makes him basically immortal unless Draco himself is killed. Our villain cannot be defeated unless our hero kills the dragon that he spent the entire film growing to love as a friend. It's actually a pretty great scene, even if I find Quaid's performance lacking, because of the music. To the Stars was composed by Randy Edelman, and it is way too epic for this movie. Edelman is actually known for comedies like Twins, Ghostbusters 2, Kindergarten Cop, and The Mask. Never judge somebody based on their previous work though, because the death of this dragon is given the weight and importance that it deserves. There's obviously a tragic element to the score, but it builds and builds to something that sounds triumphant, heroic even. To the Stars reminds me of what this movie could have been. It's probably grander than it deserves, but I wouldn't have it any other way. It's so good that I don't even care how cheesy it is that Draco transforms into a bunch of particles and literally ascends into the stars. The music manages to make it seem like this is what the entire story has been building to, giving the entire film so much more weight. And it did so in my mind for years. When I went back to rewatch it, I was shocked at how silly this movie was at times because I remembered how epic the final scene was. One of the most underrated and epic pieces of music I've ever heard. And since we're on the topic of epic music, okay, now I know this may be a crazy, wild hot take, but Michael Bay's Transformers movie isn't very good. I know. I will say, though, his very first Transformers effort is easily his best one. It's definitely a movie that I had a great time with in theaters back in 2007, and it really helped me to get into the old school series, so I can't completely hate it. This certainly isn't a movie that has nothing going for it. The CGI is insanely good and holds up shockingly well today. I think a lot of that comes from just how well they handle the scale of the Transformers themselves. They're always shot from low angles or from a distance. They're giant robots, and this movie makes them feel appropriately giant. Honestly, the Transformers are the only thing that this movie gets completely right. While they aren't given a ton of personality or character, they aren't portrayed badly. Optimus Prime is still the ultimate force for good, and Megatron is his rival. When they see each other for the first time in the film and say each other's names, that shit was hype. I don't care who you are.
Megatron Prime!
With all that said, though, you can cut out every single scene with the human characters and lose nothing. For some reason, the robots from the cartoon are mostly played seriously, while all of the humans act like cartoon characters, with comedy that really struggles to land. As much as it sucked to sit through these characters, it was all worth it when the rest of the Autobots finally arrived on Earth, accompanied by the appropriately titled track, Arrival to Earth. Steve Jablonsky is primarily known for his collaborations with Bay and Hans Zimmer, having composed several films directed or produced by Bay, as well as scores for some video games like Command & Conquer and Gears of War. For Transformers, he really made these alien robots feel almost godlike. There's a mystique to them portrayed through the music, putting us in the headspace of the human characters that are seeing something truly extraordinary. The sequence that accompanies the track works primarily because of, honestly, how well this film is paced. We had only really gotten grand reveals for the Decepticons up until this point, and they were always backed up by intense, threatening music. The Autobots, at first, don't look any different from the Decepticons, but the music lets us know that they are to be marveled at, to feel safe around. We get a great montage of them emerging from craters and disguising themselves as different vehicles as the music crescendos into this beautiful reveal of Optimus Prime. Even before the legendary Peter Cullen utters a single word, you feel just how important he is. You know that this is the robot in charge. You should feel intimidated and humbled by his appearance. The Transformers films undeniably had a huge impact on popular culture. They were massive films, with each one getting bigger and bigger for a few years. While we may look back on these films as big, bloated products of their time, it's important to remember just how much of an impact that first film had. And I really think the soundtrack had something to do with that. The Transformers were an event because the film made them into one. You were amazed by what you were seeing. Of course, there's another bit off that soundtrack that became iconic in its own right, and while it may not fit with the orchestral score theme that I have established in this video, I will end this section with a mention of it, because I think we're all in agreement, every movie should end like this. Here's what's good about Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Alan Rickman. This guy.
We ain't got nothing to eat!
What do we need?
That's it. That's about it. Everything else in this movie just doesn't hold up. Of course, this didn't stop me from wearing out my VHS tape and then eventual double-sided DVD, remember those? Copy of Kevin Costner's Robin Hood. Or should I call it Kevin Costner's attempt to do an English accent? I don't know what's funnier, the fact that Costner utterly fails to pull off an accent so bad that it makes Dick Van Dyke sound like Daniel Day-Lewis, or that he just kind of gives up on the accent halfway into the movie and just starts speaking in his regular voice.
Azim, what does it mean?
It means great one.
Great one, really? Did you give yourself this name? This is blood money, Marion. It's intended to bribe King Richard's enemies to unite against him.
Kevin, Robin Hood is a famously English character. Maybe don't take the part if you can't pull off the accent. With all that said, Robin Hood is kind of a hilarious movie. It's so overtly loud and over the top that it feels like parody at times. Just watch this. Every single actor is going for it here, and you've really got to admire how campy this is. Alan Rickman f***ing understood his assignment and delivers in one of the greatest performances of his career. He is amazing, no notes.
Loxley! I'm gonna cut your heart out with a spoon!
I feel like this movie really wanted to strive for being some kind of epic. Something like a classic out of old Hollywood, and the opening title score perfectly reflects that. The title sequence itself is pretty low-key, with tapestry and artwork accompanying music that really makes you feel like you're watching something regal and refined. I love how the music escalates and builds, really preparing you for the adventure you're about to go on. This score was composed by the late Michael Kamen, and I know for a fact there are several of you out there right now whose ears perked up when you heard this music. Yes, you do recognize it from somewhere. That is, if you owned any Disney DVD in the early 2000s.
We have our heading.
Here we go!
From the magic within our hearts.
That's right, Disney purchased the rights to this score and used it as the opening to all of their films on home video for years. I remember thinking that it sounded familiar, and when I rewatched Robin Hood, I was floored to realize that this was where that music came from. This isn't the first time that Disney has done this with the work of Michael Kamen either. Kamen was a very accomplished composer for some of my favorite films of all time. Lethal Weapon, Die Hard, and the Iron Freaking Giant People. Also, as a Metallica fan, he was the composer and arranger for their symphonic live album. Okay, getting back to my point. Terry Gilliam's Brazil, a masterpiece by the way, features a track composed by Kamen called The Office. And some of you might recognize this as well from a few trailers that Disney put out, specifically the trailer for WALL-E. This practice of purchasing the rights of a film score for marketing is actually more common than you may realize. As a matter of fact, To the Stars from Dragonheart was also purchased and used heavily in advertisements. Robin Hood and Dragonheart are examples of how the musical score of a film can outlive the movie itself, and honestly, that's the essence of what I'm talking about here. I don't rewatch these films very often anymore. I may have when I was a kid, but they live on for me in my playlists. Some scores are just so good that they stand the test of time more than their actual movies, because someone recognized how good they were and used them elsewhere. I'm now going to talk about the greatest example of a musical score outliving its movie. I want to ask you a question. When you imagine a character in a film running dramatically in slow motion, is there a piece of music that you can think of that accompanies that image? That piece of music that's basically become its own cliche at this point is simply titled Opening Titles, but it has become known by the name of the film that it comes from, the British sports drama film Chariots of Fire. Have any of you actually seen Chariots of Fire? Has anyone seen Chariots of Fire? I'm genuinely asking, because for years I had no clue where this music came from, yet it seemed to be everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Well, you might be shocked to learn that Chariots of Fire was the recipient of 5 Oscars, including Best Picture. Nobody remembers this movie. As a matter of fact, the only times I've seen it discussed at all is either in reference to its soundtrack or when people make lists of the worst movies that have ever won Best Picture. It has no relevance whatsoever today outside of its music. The reason that the score works so well can be summed up in one word, or name actually.
Vangelis.
The legendary composer of several synth masterpieces from the 80s. This is his most iconic singular track, but he's most well known among sci-fi fans as the original composer for Blade Runner. His skill in crafting such an emotional piece of music with only a grand piano and a synthesizer earned him the Academy Award for Best Original Score. This is the only award that I would argue Chariots of Fire deserves. If you ever had any doubt that the Academy was bullshit, just remember that Chariots of Fire beat Raiders of the Lost Ark for Best Picture that year. Also, while we're crapping on the Oscars, be sure to tune into my channel on March 10th, where I will be streaming my live commentary of the 2024 Academy Awards. It'll be a fun little watch party, and I hope to see you there. So, why did I decide to make a video on this topic? Well, other than just wanting to recommend some great music, I think we often look at films as the sum of their parts, and rightfully so. All of the pieces come together in an attempt to make a single rewarding experience, after all. But talent comes from several different places. The director is often credited as the person steering the ship, but it still takes a crew to get said ship in the water. When our experiences with a film are positive, we are quick to point out the individual elements that made it so. But when it's negative, we group it all together because we don't find any of it worthy of dissection. Sometimes that's warranted. More often than not, it really does feel like some bad movies just have no passion put into them at any stage of their production from any department. I also think it's true, however, that there are talented people trying their absolute best to make it all work and doing whatever they can from their corner to do so. James Horner, Randy Edelman, Steve Jablonsky, Michael Kamen, and Vangelis were all tasked to make an impactful musical score to accompany the films they were presented in a relatively short time span compared to pre-production. These composers poured their talent into their work and didn't half-ass it in any way. There's a phrase that's become popular nowadays. Blank didn't have to go that hard. While I have used this term in the past and even considered titling this video something similar to it, I recently realized that it's not entirely true. They do have to go that hard. It's their job. Not just composers either. Makeup, hairstyling, costuming, production design, lighting, visual effects, editing, all of these departments are hired to do the very best that they can to support their project and make it the best that it can be. Judge all aspects of a work of art fairly and honestly. I'm certainly not arguing to go easy on a film that gives you a negative experience just because people worked hard. The art can and should be critically judged. I'm just suggesting that we remember to acknowledge something that does work for us, even if the whole picture might not have. The great thing about music is we don't have to watch the movie to enjoy it. Add these tracks to your playlist and let me know in the comments if there are any particular musical scores that you love from movies that you may not necessarily love just as much. Thank you so much for watching. Again, tune in for the Oscars watch party right here on my channel on March 10th. Support me on Patreon if you'd like to do that, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.